You should. Yes, and there we go. Okay. Well, great. Well, wonderful on this chilly night. I am Joe Truesdell, and together with my husband Huck, who is kind of manning the Zoom thing a little bit. We want to welcome you all to Tide Pool Bookshop. Some people, as I mentioned, are on Zoom, and so those of you who are on Zoom, we're delighted to have you guys as well. I don't really know where to look, but I'm being on Zoom. But it's great to have you all, and we are super excited to have Frank Callahan here. This is really wonderful. So Frank grew up in Worcester, and the very cool thing is that he stayed in Worcester, which is awesome. And he spent his career as director of plan giving at Worcester Academy. Frank has always been super interested in history and in local history and Worcester history and in United States history and world history and whatnot. And also he has been, I know he has talked often about wanting to visit all 50 states. How many do you have left?
One.
Where haven't you been?
49.
You've been to 49. What's the state that you haven't?
Hawaii.
Hawaii. All right. Well, there's a good today. This would be a nice time to go.
Don't believe that.
Absolutely. So that's great. And Frank has also been very interested in genealogy. And so the son of Frank and Sid Crowley Callahan, Frank is the great grandson of Dennis Crowley, right? Who started Polar Beverages, and one outcome of his interest in genealogy is the fact that he has this wonderful talk, a family history of the Crowleys and Polar. And this is part one. We can't wait to see part two. So we're going to book him very soon, and we'll let you know when that all happens. Absolutely. So welcome, Frank, and we are just so happy.
This talk is about my mother's family, the Crowleys, and their family business, Polar Beverages. Polar is now a national company under the leadership of my cousins, Ralph and Chris Crowley. And while the company has grown exponentially under their management, the foundation for their success took place through the efforts of their father and his three brothers. In this talk, I will discuss the beginnings of the family in the United States, the founding of the company and its history, but end this first part just prior to the time that my grandfather passed the reins on to his four sons.
Audio is difficult on Zoom.
Crowley. Known as Boss, he fostered a legacy of a family business that is now in its fifth generation. Family businesses are the most common form of business, but most do not last beyond 2 generations. And while the Crowley family has been deeply close over the years, the transition of passing the business from one generation down to the next has been challenging, partly due to illness. In addition, the closeness of the family, rather than easing the process, made these transitions much more challenging. And I don't talk about it in this talk, I do it at the end of the second section. Now, here we go. Let's see if this works.
So if you want to go. You want to go back to the
Yes, I want to go back.
Okay. So I'm gonna take okay, I'm gonna get this. This is so you want to go previous slide. Let me know when you're ready. Because all you have to do is just
yes. I think I'll left click the next time around. There it is. Okay. Yep.
Okay. So then, yeah.
Okay, we'll do. We are called Famine Irish, and there's a lot of us in Worcester, and people in Worcester must wonder, why are there so many Irish? The answer is the potato. The potato is native to South America, and there are more than 4,000 varieties on the slopes of the Andes Mountains, and hundreds of potato varieties have been domesticated for human consumption. Due to its nutritional value, starting in the 1500s, Spanish invaders brought a handful of varieties of the potato back to Europe, and it's believed that the potato was brought to Ireland in 1580. Because of the temperate climate and damp soil of Ireland, the potato adapted well, even in marginal land of poor quality and rocky soil. Gradually, more potatoes were planted because they could feed more families. For instance, grains native to Europe, such as wheat, required 5 acres to feed just one family. The potato could feed 3 families in the same amount of land, and no horse or plow was needed. By the 18th century, because the potato fed more people, families grew. And the impact of this growth was that the population almost doubled from 3 million in 1750 to 5.25 million in 1800. And then by 1845, the population had grown to 8.2 million. I've heard numbers like 9 million. This growth was particularly strong in the poorest areas where the families became over-dependent on the potato. By the early 1840s, roughly 3/4 of the people in rural Ireland, mostly the poor Western counties, were largely or totally dependent on the potato or the subsistence crop for their source of food. However, because one high-yielding variety known as the Irish lumper, horrible name, was dominant throughout the country, almost all of the country's potato crop was a monoculture or monocrop. And with no genetic diversity, the entire country was vulnerable if disease struck. And so when a blight caused by a fungus appeared in 1845, it attacked the entire potato crop throughout all of Ireland and attacked again and again each year until 1850. Specifically, the blight wilted the leaves, then turned the plant black and so rotten it was inedible. This was particularly devastating in the poor Western counties because of their overdependence on the potato. And the lack of another source of food led to starvation. In that decade alone, it's estimated that 1 million Irish succumbed to diseases related to starvation. And in addition, between another 1 to 2.5 million more Irish left their homeland for other countries, most of them to the United States. And most of those that went to the US went to places where the Irish had previously settled, such as Worcester. This pattern of following other immigrants is called chain migration. And in the case of Worcester, the famine Irish followed the Irish who had built the Blackstone Canal in the 1820s. I'll talk a bit more about the canal diggers later. This era is known as the Irish famine, and it was emotionally devastating as the farmers did not know what was happening. They could not understand why their food had gone bad. And it was not for many, many years that the blight became understood. It's for this reason that the famine left deep emotional scars with bitter memories tinged with shame. Survivor's guilt. Here we go. See. Great. Immigration to the United States during the famine and after became a more popular option for the Irish as travel across the Atlantic Ocean had become safer, faster, and less expensive. This is the naturalization document for Cornelius Crowley, who came to the United States on the 29th of March in 1852. What's important here is that the date of his arrival to New York is indicated, so his passage to America can be found. Oh, you can see that. At that time, immigrant women only became US citizens upon the date of their marriage. And so there's no naturalization document for the woman that he would marry here in the States. And so the date of her arrival would be almost impossible to find. Good. This is the manifest for the ship Racer, which sailed from Liverpool, England to New York in 1852. Cornelius is listed as a laborer from Ireland. For some reason, his age is listed as 15, which was 2 years younger than his actual age. Maybe he's looking for a discount, I don't know. And then on the right here is a Currier and Ives print of the Racer. And as its name implies, it was a clipper ship. Clipper ships were sailboats designed to be faster or sail at a good clip. Those able to leave Ireland were relatively wealthier, as opposed to the poor who could not afford passage to America. Ireland was very rural, and so the immigrants are mostly referred to as from the county where they came from rather than by a city or a town. The eastern counties of Ireland were wealthier, and the immigrants from those parts emigrated to Worcester in family groups prior to the famine. For instance, my Callahan ancestors came from Queens County in Eastern County just prior to the famine, and they came as a family. During and after the famine, more came from the poorer Western counties, typically came to Worcester by themselves. Most were illiterate. From the ship's manifest, we know that Cornelius came alone, and from his naturalization document that he hailed from County Kerry in southwestern Ireland. But his family must have had better means, as both he and his family could both read and write. Here's some family letters from the 1870s. On the left is a letter from my third great grandmother, Mary Ellen, maiden name Sullivan Crowley, to her son Cornelius. On the right is a letter to Cornelius from a nephew named John B. Crowley, who served in the US Navy. Here are my great-great-grandparents, Cornelius and Anne, maiden name Moriarty Crowley. Both came from Calorglin in County Kerry. Again, both came from a poorer Western county, which was typical of the famine Irish. This is my theory, at least, from anecdotes around Worcester, that most of the famine Irish were from the Western counties. Because there were no opportunities for women in Ireland, Irish women immigrated to the United States in equal or greater numbers than men. In fact, by the end of the 19th century, 53% of the Irish immigrant were single women. During this era, Irish women traveled by themselves to America, and coming to the United States alone was a pattern that was unique among European women at this time. And most of the women from Europe, they came with their husband or wife. I mean, they came with their husband or they came with their family. Irish women came by themselves. In America, 60% of these single women found work as domestic servants or else found work in factories. Importantly, if they remained single, they did not become US citizens. And I have a little addendum at the end of this talk to show you. Anne Moriarty was from a family of 7 children who settled in Milford, Mass. Presumably, Anne met Cornelius in Milford as they married there in 1856. Like her husband, Anne could both read and write English, so her family must have come from better means, and possibly she came with relatives. We do know that her mother's maiden name was Ellen Howard, and that Ellen converted to the Catholic faith, which might be an indication that they had better means, but that's maybe a guess. Soon after his arrival, Cornelius worked in shoe factories in a job called a boot crimper. Boot and shoe manufacturing in Worcester was thriving in the 1850s, and nearly a third of the workers in those factories were Irish immigrants. Early in his career, while working in a machine, Cornelius was lashed in the eye by a piece of leather, and as a result, lost the vision in that eye. That is why this photo is taken in profile to hide that eye. As they had in Ireland, the first generation Irish had large families. In fact, by 1900, 30% of the city of Worcester's population of 118,000 were first or second generation Irish. Ellen, the first of their 9 children, was born in Milford, and the growing family moved back and forth between Milford and Worcester over the next few years. Dennis Mark, the third oldest, was born in Milford in 1862. I put it, I hope you can see his name above him. And then I'll also talk about a sister named Eugenia. So there's Dennis Mark, born in 1862. The family lived in tenements around South Worcester until Cornelius and Anne purchased a plot of land in that section of the city. Got to jump here. In that section of the city in 1888 on Sheridan Street, which is adjacent to the Sacred Heart Catholic Church on Cambridge Street. On the left is the deed of purchase, and the mortgage documents with People's Savings Bank were on the right. Second generation Irish lived at home until marriage, which helped their immigrants' parents pay the bills. The house was one of, or is one of Worcester's many 3-deckers. And like a lot of immigrant Irish, the family probably pooled their incomes along with the rent from the other tenants in order to pay the mortgage. So you can see the documents right there. Their payoff ledger is on the left in this shot, and then the mortgage payoff is on the right there. And this must have been a big deal to the Crowleys, as they were Catholic, and most of the land back in Ireland was under the control of Protestant landlords. So they had few opportunities to own land back in their home country. One day, a stranger appeared at the front door at 10 Sheridan Street and asked for Eugenia Crowley. He said his name was George Reedy, and he had seen her in church. He lived nearby and was a graduate of Holy Cross. He asked her to marry him, but divulged that he had a heart condition. So if she said no, that would be okay, and he'd go. She said yes. They married, had 2 daughters, and George died of heart disease at age 45. Eugenia and her daughters remained at 10 Sheridan after the rest of the family moved on. Eugenia was a public school teacher, which was very typical of second-generation Irish women in American cities. For instance, by 1910, the majority of public school teachers in Providence, Boston, New York, Chicago, San Francisco were second-generation Irish women. In fact, Chicago was 70%. So hope you can see this. Here's Sacred Heart Church on this map. There's the church up in the top left-hand corner. That's Cambridge Street right there. There's Sheridan Street. The house was right there. There it is today. And there's Eugenia with her two daughters. The neighborhood where the family lived was known as the Island due to the construction in the 1820s of the Blackstone Canal. The Mill Brook, which was the canal, had a large bend in the stream in South Worcester. To shorten the route, the Irish workers who were hired to build the canal dug a straight channel that connected each end of the oxbow so that water flowed around the meadowlands in the middle. I believe this channel it has a problematic legacy, which I'll discuss at the end of this section. The Blackstone fostered the American Industrial Revolution through the investment of the Yankee Protestants who lived in Worcester's town center. Due to the Yankees' hostility of their Catholic faith, the Irish immigrants were forced to live separately. And the island was one of the first Irish settlements in Worcester for immigrants who worked in the factories that were powered by the water of the Blackstone. By the way, in the 1960s, Green Street was added to that nickname, so it's now referred to as Green Island. The island was a rough neighborhood, and soon after joining the working world, Dennis became a bartender in the working men's saloon near the factories. He was 6 feet tall and powerfully built, and the family lore is that he was a boxer, which helped him to maintain order in the roughhouse saloons. Like most famine Irish, Dennis was locked into a system with few opportunities. Early in that century, the pre-famine Irish had enormous expertise in building canals, first in England, then they went to New York and built the Erie Canal, then they came to Worcester and they built the Blackstone Canal, and then they started building railroads, first here in Worcester and then throughout New England. So they came to Worcester for financial gain or economic opportunity. In contrast, the famine Irish were refugees of a massive human catastrophe and had almost no skills to offer. By the time of the famine Irish and their children, the canal diggers were deceased, and though there were some descendants of the pre-famine Irish working in transportation, construction, or retail shops, none of these were professions that Dennis chose to pursue. In addition, his father had no valuable skills to pass along to him because by that time, the boot and shoe manufacturing in Worcester was in steep decline. Based on his personality, bartending was not a great career choice for Dennis. Most Irish bartenders were engaging personalities who told colorful stories to their customers. Dennis did not fit that mold. He was a teetotaler with ambitions beyond working in the saloons. But like a lot of the famine Irish, he lacked the great skills of the canal diggers. So he had few options for career advancement because of the anti-Catholic Protestant factory owners. There were second-generation Irish sons in professions such as medicine or the practice of law, but their opportunities at that time were modest. Moreover, Dennis was not a creative genius like other local businessmen, such as Loren Coase, who invented the monkey wrench, or Ichabod Washburn with his innovations for wire production, or William and George Crompton with their many patents for power looms. What he was, though, was a very shrewd and able businessman. And the only businesses thriving for the Irish were the saloons. And thus selling alcohol was the path that he chose. By selling alcohol, Dennis had entered into a very tricky situation as the Irish had a very bad reputation for problem drinking, well deserved. It's for this reason that the selling of alcohol was opposed by the local business leaders, which was backed up by the newspapers. Alcohol sales were also controversial within the Catholic Church. In fact, most of the temperance societies were led by parish priests. It's possibly for that reason that Dennis kept a low profile. For instance, there's no advertising for his firm in local publications, nor are there any profiles of him in Nuts History of Worcester or publications like that. In his personal life, in December 1886, Dennis married Mary Rourke, who also grew up in the island. And like Dennis, Mary was the child of famine immigrants, and her father came from the western county of Galway. In the early years of their marriage, Dennis and Mary lived on the island, and their 5 sons were born there. This is Mary, maiden name Kelly Rourke, the mother of Dennis's wife, Mary Rourke Crowley. She lived to be 95, and my mother and her siblings referred to her as Gomawok because they could not pronounce Ramarok. They were a little taken aback by her, not only because of her very old age and Irish accent, but by the fact that she smoked a pipe. Mary and her husband, Andrew, raised her sister's daughter, Kate Cohn, C-O-A-N, whose mother died at Kate's birth. Kate was often called Catherine Rourke, and she took care of Mama Rourke into her old age. So in effect, she was the younger sister of Mary Crowley, Boss's wife. Sadly, while Catherine was effectively adopted at birth, she had 3 older siblings who were placed in an orphanage because they had been abandoned by their father. Many years later, my grandfather regularly sent holiday gifts to the Little Sisters of the Poor, the founders of this orphanage, but his children never knew why. His orphaned relatives must be the reason. After several years of working in the island saloon, a business opportunity motivated Dennis to leave the island and move his family to another section of the city to be near his new venture. In 1901, Dennis founded D.M. Crowley and Company at 68 Summer Street in Worcester, and he moved his family to an apartment across the street at 101 Summer. In those days, Summer Street started at Washington Square opposite the train station and ended at Lincoln Square, the busy intersection at the north end of Main Street. That's not the case today. It still starts at the train station, but no longer touches at Lincoln Square, and I'll talk about that at the end of this section. At first, Dennis sold liquor from a wagon, and the family lore is that he sold whiskey to factory hands as they left work. Tragically, that first year, his father, Cornelius, was killed falling off a ladder at the store, and his mother and his sister also died that year. So you can see in the picture, there's Dennis holding the reins. He's on the left. It says Crowley's Ballbrook Whiskey, and Ballbrook is a brook in Holden, Massachusetts, and Huck seems to be familiar with it. And I'm guessing that that might be the house on Summer Street where the business was, but that's purely a guess. The move to Summer Street appears to have been made through a family connection. 4 doors down at 111 Summer Street was J.G. Bieberback and Sons, manufacturers of ginger ale and mineral waters. The lead principal, Johann or George Bieberback, was a German immigrant and master brewer who introduced lager beer to Massachusetts and New England. In 1882, he founded the firm with 2 of his sons, and within a few years, they sold whiskeys, wines, cordials, etc. The Bieberbacks both lived and worked at 111 Summer Street, so they must have had close contact with the Crowleys, as they were very close neighbors and in the exact same business. In addition, they had a family connection. George Jr. was married to Cecilia Daniels, an Irish immigrant and cousin of Mary Rourke Crowley, Dennis's wife. The Bieberback connection is the reason I believe that Boss left the island. He must have felt it was important to be closer to the Bieberback business on Summer Street. Though I have no documentation, I think they worked in concert in their businesses for many years. For instance, almost all the saloons in Worcester were owned by Irish Catholics, who might have been reluctant to buy liquor from the Bieberbacks, who were German and Protestant, but would buy from another Irish Catholic. Moreover, the Bieberbacks advertised prominently in the Worcester directories each year, while there was absolutely nothing for D.M. Crowley and Company, which tells me they had no need to advertise as he worked so closely with the Bieberbacks. In a related matter, the Bieberbacks at this time were being sued for a non-payment of a loan, and there was also a reference to a bankruptcy, so that might have been a factor of why they got together. Finally, most second-generation Irish remained in their home neighborhood. Why did Dennis leave an apartment in a 3-decker, which his father had bought for him, and leave the home neighborhood of the island to move to a new neighborhood and start a company, unless he had some confidence in the future success of this business associate? The Bieberback connection must have been very promising. Over the next 2 decades, D.M. Crowley and Company did well, but by 1916, the public sentiments against liquor were growing, so Dennis diversified his business. First, he bought the wholesale bottling division of the Bieberback firm, then a few months later purchased the Leicester Polar Spring Company, which was a branch of a Maine company. The photo on the right here is of their Worcester office. It was on Mercantile Street in Worcester. By the way, the spring is still owned by Polar Beverages. It is located on Polar Spring Road, which is on the Leicester Spencer Town Line. It's also along the Mid-State Trail. Dennis, now known as Boss, named the business Beaver Polar Company, the combination of the names of the 2 companies he had purchased. The 1882 Beaver Polar founding date may have come from the family connection to the Bieberbacks and the business that they must have done over the years. But most significantly, Boss purchased the Bieberback bottling plant at 111 Summer Street, where the business had been located since 1882. 111 Summer Street remained the headquarters of the business until the late 1960s. And then after the company moved, the buildings were demolished, and it is now a parking lot for a medical arts building at the corner of MLK Boulevard and Summer Street. It's diagonally opposite the post office, if that's a help to you. And it remains an Irish enclave because we all go there for the skin doctor. There's a lot of Irish jokes in the skin doctor. Don't get us going. Dennis and Mary's 5 sons were Cornelius J., known as C. Joseph, born 1887, Frank Andrew, born 1888, Eugene Dennis, born 1891, Walter William, born 1893, and my grandfather, Edward Dennis, the youngest, born in 1896. When the family lived at 101 Summer Street, the Thomas Street Grammar School was visible from their apartment window. Here's the photo of my grandfather's Thomas Street school class. The school was at the corner of Thomas and Summer Streets, where the Visiting Nurse Association, or VNA headquarters, is now located. And I've got a little blue arrow that shows where my grandfather is in the class photo. And then the arrow in the lower part shows where the Thomas Street School was. And the street that goes up and down there, that's Summer Street right there. And the apartment where they lived was below where the Thomas Street School was in that photograph. In 1907, Dennis expanded his business interests by purchasing 2 significant buildings in Lincoln Square, one of the city's busiest intersections. The Dean Building was the smaller of the 2 and was located at the corner of Summer Street. The liquor store was on the ground level of that building. The Salisbury Building was larger, and the family lived upstairs in one of its 7-room apartments. Rockelman's Market was on the street level of that building. Boss purchased the buildings from the Worcester Art Museum, which controlled the estate of the original owner, Stephen Salisbury III, and the mortgage was through the Mechanics Bank in Worcester. The fact that this Yankee bank made him a loan is impressive, since Irish liquor dealers were typically not creditworthy in this era. The 2 buildings were separated by railroad tracks, and the relocations of the track comes up at the end of this section. So I hope you can see it. The Dean Building is the long, narrow one to the right when you're looking at it. And then in between them is the railroad tracks. I hope you can make that out. And then the Salisbury Building is the one that's a square. And then up above at the top of there is Lincoln Square itself. And then Summer Street would be to the right of the Dean Building, and to the right of Summer Street, that's where the Worcester Police Headquarters is nowadays, if that's a help to you. And by the way, that's a postcard at the top right-hand corner. That's not the Salisbury Building in that one on the right. The 2 buildings are on the left-hand side in that photograph. As his older sons came of age, they joined the business. In 1905, oldest son C. Joseph was listed in the firm as a clerk. Then in 1910, second oldest son Frank did the same. Middle son Eugene joined in 1913, and finally the 2 youngest sons, Walter and Edward, came on board in 1916 as chauffeurs in the liquor business. Interestingly, Edward is listed as the president of the Polar Spring Division in 1917. So top right is Frank, the second oldest. C. Joseph, the oldest, is sitting down on the right-hand side. There's Eugene, middle son. Below him to the left is Walter. And then my grandfather is sitting on his father's lap in that shot. However, Boss's business plans were interrupted by World War I, when 4 of his sons joined the army. Only son Frank did not go into the army. He had married in 1916, and by 1918 had a son. By the way, his son Frank Jr., known as Red, went on to found Ken's Foods, which is another Crowley family business, but entirely separate from Polar. Eugene was the only son sent to Europe, but by the time he got there, the war was over and he soon came back. As a small boy, I asked my grandfather the inevitable question of what he did in the war. His reply was, "I did a lot more than George Washington O'Reilly." My grandfather was an august man of few words, so rather than challenge him, I went to my father and asked, "Who is George Washington O'Reilly?" "George Washington O'Reilly is a professional Irishman," was my father's response. I then went to my mother and asked, "What's a professional Irish?" She explained that it's a self-promoter who exploited their ethnicity for unjustified profit. That my family had a low opinion of George Washington O'Reilly. I was 5 years old. After their service, oldest son, C. Joseph, ran the liquor store in Lincoln Square. Second son, Frank, ran restaurants and owned hotels in Miami, Florida, Cape Cod, and later in Worcester. The three youngest sons ran Beeple Polar. Middle son, Eugene, proved to be a strong businessman who helped build the business. Walter also worked at the plant, but he sold his interest to pursue oil exploration in Oklahoma. Walter later owned a significant parcel of land near what is now Miami Airport. He sold it prior to the Depression. My mother maintained that the family owned a quarter of Boca Raton. If so, things for the Crowley family would have been vastly different. Edward ran the plant. He had a relaxed business style, and each day at lunch instructed the employees to shut down all the machines so that they could play the card game of cribbage. One day he received a perfect score in cribbage, and word of his accomplishment got back to the newspaper, which published his score. To his complete outrage, he could not stand publicity. Prohibition, the constitutional amendment banning the sale of alcohol, had a profound impact on the family's business. They knew prohibition was coming because in 1917, the US Senate proposed the 18th Amendment. And by January 1920, the Volstead Act codifying the amendment took effect. The law banned alcohol sales, but did allow for the sale of alcohol for medical purposes. Based on this quirk in the law, my grandfather, Edward, was briefly a pharmacist at the liquor store. Really strange. So, but business must not have been great at the liquor store because a little bit later, C. Joseph ran a lunch wagon. The term bootlegger became popular during Prohibition for the illegal sale of liquor. And the word's origin comes from the 18th century smugglers who put valuables in their large sea boots to hide the items from the authorities. There are anecdotes that the Crowleys were bootleggers during Prohibition. And while these stories are entertaining and probably true, bootlegging was probably not a significant part of the business. In reality, Beeple Polar thrived during Prohibition through a close connection to alcohol sales that was completely and totally legal. An explanation is needed here. Obviously, Prohibition totally changed the drinking habits of the nation, but in ways that are not so well known or understood. Prior to Prohibition, the consumption of beer and hard liquor were roughly in the same proportion. But because beer took up so much space to transport, it was hard to smuggle. The result was that beer consumption declined by 90% during Prohibition. On the other hand, spirits or hard liquor could be transported in a concentrated form. So the consumption of high-proof liquor actually increased a bit during Prohibition. Prior to Prohibition, whiskey was the most popular spirit. It was drunk straight and at room temperature. Think of the cowboy movies we've all seen where the bartender places a shot on the bar for the cowboy. That all changed because bootleg whiskey tasted lousy. So mixers were needed to improve the taste. It was at this time that a lighter flavor of ginger ale, known as pale ale ginger ale, grew to be the dominant seller in order to mix with whiskey. More significantly, gin became the dominant drink because it was easy to make. Just mix grain alcohol with juniper extract. That's it. It's for that reason that during Prohibition, the term bathtub gin was coined. However, drinking gin straight did not appeal to the taste of the drinking public. So quinine water was needed to make gin and tonics. Despite Prohibition, America experienced tremendous growth in its consumer culture, and cocktails became very popular because electric refrigerators could produce ice for drinks. This lifestyle was depicted by F. Scott Fitzgerald, grandson of a famous Irishman, whose fiction portrayed the flamboyance and excess of the Jazz Age. His best-known work, The Great Gatsby, published in 1922, featured the bootlegger Jay Gatsby as the protagonist. The novel references several cocktails, and club soda was often a key ingredient for cocktails such as gin rickeys or Tom Collins drinks. Soon after the law went into effect, smugglers known as rum runners shipped rum from the Caribbean to the eastern shores of the United States, where the rum was mixed with carbonated cola to make rum and cokes. Beeple Polar did quite well during Prohibition because their products were mixers for illegal alcohol. But these mixers were not meant for the general public. And by the general public, I mean my family. My grandmother Crowley felt that Polar was terrible stuff, and she did not allow her children to drink any Polar products. In 1919, Boss Crowley purchased a home at 75 Lancaster Street, across the street from the Worcester Art Museum. The four unmarried sons lived there. His wife, Mary, was a very good cook, and the sons came home for lunch every weekday. And on weekends, the family hosted relatives. Dennis owned one of the first cars in Worcester, and there was a garage in the yard to store the vehicle. The house was demolished in the 1950s for additional parking for the Trinity Lutheran Church. So those on the left, those are diagrams that my mother drew of the first and second floor of the house. And this is, she did this from memory. She was really obsessed with this house. And then on the map at the top, white portion, that's where the Trinity Lutheran Church, the street at the top is Salisbury Street. And then the house was down a little bit from the church. On the right-hand side is Lancaster Street. And then out of the picture there would be the art museum. And I have some aerials that the Worcester Historical Museum was good enough to furnish to me. Thank you very much. And so you can get some glimpses of the house. And based on some of the, and this is a postcard of the front of the Worcester Art Museum. And in the right-hand corner was a glimpse of the house. So based on that, I talked to Kate Moran, and so she's drawn some pictures of renderings of what the house looked like. And so I can pass those out. So this is what we think the house looked like. So we can't find any pictures anywhere. So despite our best efforts.
Frank, did you say the one on the left is the art museum, the earliest stage, or what?
So that the one on the left is a postcard. And so I took the extreme right-hand side of in the main part of the postcard is the front of the Worcester Art Museum. And that was just happened to be on the right-hand side. So I got a glimpse of it in that postcard. So. Boss retired in 1920 and purchased the home in Monument Beach in the town of Bourne on Cape Cod. My mother visited the house as a child, and one night her uncle Eugene came home late, having spent the evening drinking and carousing with two notorious twin sisters. Eugene was a booming character out of the roaring 20s and was his mother's favorite son. But his wild ways, at least on that night, did not sit well with his mother. Upon his arrival, she confronted him, and their loud shouting match terrified my mother so much that she opened up her bedroom window and crawled all down to the roof because she was convinced they were going to murder each other. The reason for her reaction was that she had never heard adults shouting. Her parents were very gentle people who never argued nor raised their voices. So there, you can see in the photograph, there's Jean in the top left hand, and there's my mother in the shot, and there's Mary Rourke Crowley, and there's the Cape House right there. Two of the hotels that Frank Crowley, the second oldest son, owned were the Hotel Norcross and the Hotel Standish. The Norcross was located a quarter of a mile from the Monument Beach house, and when Frank owned it, it was a dump. He sold it, and the subsequent owners did nothing to improve it, and it remained a dump. Each time the hotel changed hands, the new owner placed an advertisement in the newspapers calling it the new Norcross. For that reason, our family always referred to it in conversation as the new Norcross. It was demolished in the 1970s and replaced with a private home. Frank later owned the Standish, which was a residential hotel on Main Street in Worcester. A portion of that building has been removed, but the Standish remains across the street from the downtown YMCA. Frank lived there with his family, and he ran the cafe that both at the bottom of the hotel, which was called the Standish Cafe. And then he also ran a Standish Cafe in the Salisbury building in Lincoln Square, which he named for the hotel. And so he lived in the Standard Hotel Standish with his family. And then after Boss passed away, his mother, Mary Rourke Crowley, also lived with him too. Boss passed away in 1930 at age 67. His estate was administered by the oldest sons, C. Joseph and Frank, along with their mother. In 1935, 5 years later, his widow, Mary A. Crowley, drew up her will, which appointed her youngest son, Edward, to be the executor. In her will, she stipulated that the house at 75 Lancaster Street be left to Edward and that the mortgage be paid off by the estate. She also indicated that her share of Beaver Polar Company be left to Edward's son, Dennis, my mother's brother. She made specific dollar bequests to her husband's relatives and to her cousin Kate Cohn, and her jewelry was to be divided amongst her daughters-in-law, with one notable exception. 45-year-old son Eugene had recently married his 19-year-old secretary. She was to receive a piece of jewelry. So Mary, in my interpretation, Mary did not approve of that marriage. 2 years later, Mary made a codicil to her will that the portion of her estate for her son Walter be placed in a trust to be managed by the Mechanics Bank. This stemmed from Walter's alcoholism, which made him incapable of administering his own affairs. Later that year, Walter's wife filed for divorce, indicating that said husband, in quotes, that said husband has contracted gross and confirmed habits of intoxication caused by voluntary and excessive use of intoxicating liquors. Mary passed away in 1939, and making youngest son Edward the executor to her will must have caught his older brothers by surprise. 6 months later, his brother Frank filed to dispute the will. Disputing a will is quite unusual, and while there are no reasons indicated, it may have stemmed from Walter's illness. For instance, the legal steps to handle his affairs were made 2 years after Mary's original will was signed. In any case, within 6 months, a settlement was drawn up, and it indicated that 75 Lancaster Street was now to be encumbered. In addition, the dollar bequests to the relatives were reduced, and there is no mention of jewelry in the settlement, nor mention of her grandson Dennis receiving her share of Beaver Pole. When my mother learned about the bequest of her grandparents' home, she begged her parents to move into 75 Lancaster Street, as she loved that house so much. They would have none of that idea, and they sold it. I believe it would have been controversial to move into this very prominent house because it would have upset the brothers. More pictures from the Worcester Historical Museum. In the early 1950s, the Salisbury and Dean buildings were taken by eminent domain and demolished for the urban renewal project to move the railroad tracks in Lincoln Square into a tunnel to be constructed underneath the square. C. Joseph lived in the Salisbury building, and he and his wife raised their 2 sons there. He passed away in 1946 at the age of 59, and a few years later, his widow moved the package store to the Tatnick section of Worcester. Our cousin Ann Crowley ran that business up until a decade or so ago. The package store sign was moved to this Tatnick location, and it remains inside the store. So there's that's if you go to the Tatnick location, that sign was on the Dean building. And also, I hope you can see some of the railroad signals that are in between the buildings. So the railroad tracks went between the 2 buildings. And so that's the Salisbury building on the right. One more slide of the. So this has a better view of the Salisbury building. And this is from the auditorium. And in the photo on the right, I don't know if you can see it, but the Standish Cafe you can make out, and you can make out Brockleman's on the first floor of the Salisbury building. So this is the next to last slide in part 1. But I'd like to end this section by asking the question, whatever happened to the island, the section where Boss grew up and everything else like that? So anyway, at the very top in this one of the channel is Kelly Square, and so Polar Park is just a little bit off of the square. I had mentioned that I think that building that channel was very problematic, and the reason why I believe that is prior to the construction of the canal, the Millbrook just meandered through South Worcester, and anytime there were heavy rains, it not only flowed in the brook, but it also went into, I think, the meadowlands in the middle, which I think were wetlands. And so the wetlands soaked in the water during heavy rains. And then after the rains went away, they gradually reduced the water. So there wasn't massive flooding downstream. However, when they built the canal, they eventually got rid of the meandering stream, and they only had the channel. And so nowadays, when you get heavy rains, it goes down that channel. They bolstered it up over the years, but you end up with flooding at the south part down at Cambridge Street and at Harding Street. Every time there's heavy rain, there seems like there's a flood right there. So just to follow up on the famine. In the last half of the 19th century, it's estimated that 4.5 more million Irish came to the United States. The population of Ireland has never recovered. It is the only European country with a smaller population than in the 1850s. There's about 5 million in the Republic of Ireland and 1.8 in the English part of Ireland. So it's about 6.8 million. They were 8.2 before. So Ireland's greatest export is its people. Oh, and then I wanted to follow up. I got a question. I did this talk a week or so ago at the Torch Club, and I'll pass this out for folks to look at closely. I'll also pass out the island. And so I got a question that somebody was in disbelief that if you were a single woman and came to the United States, you never became a citizen. And so I thought, well, I can figure that out. So I looked up Boss Crowley because he had a mate. And so there's Boss Crowley at the bottom of that item right there. And for whatever reason, he has a servant from Denmark. And most of the maids in that particular shot are from Ireland. I think 5 of the 7 are there, but the other ones, there's one from Sweden. But at the top column, if you look at the top on that sheet, it asks whether they are a citizen or alien. And if they were not a citizen, they put AL for alien. So these single women were resident alien. That's it.
Your family so much, right? What a class. That was fabulous. Really great. Wonderful generations. Would you be willing to take questions?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
My hearing is bad in this ear. It plugged up this morning and it hasn't come back.
I have a question. Frank, was he called boss outside the family or was that only the family?
I think it, because he ran the factory, they called him boss.
Outside the family.
Outside the family, yeah. At the Beaver Polar, yeah.
Zoom cannot hear.
Oh, one thing, we've actually had contact with the Beaverback family over the years. In fact, the reason that I contacted Joe a few months ago is that there was a family on Haviland Street named Brown, and their mother was a Beaverback. She just passed away this past summer, and she was 98 years old, but they are part of the Beaverback family. And after a little bit, I did reach her married name is Callahan of all things these days. And she says she has some old pictures of the Beaverbacks, but they're not labeled, which is to have that part of the story, you know, documented and everything else like that. So.
So is there a question from the Zoom person or not?
No, they were just saying that they couldn't hear
Oh, okay.
the question.
So you've done a lot of research here, which is great, you know, it's ongoing. Where are all the documents? And sort of got some family documents, you've got some official documents.
So
Can you-
we
Frank,
have,
can you repeat the
most
question?
of the documents.
Frank,
Can you repeat the question? Because the people
Oh,
on Zoom.
So Jock wanted to know where are all the documents? I am in possession of the photographs. I am in possession, I think they're photocopies of the mortgage documents and that type of thing. And I think my mother obtained those from the daughter of Eugenia, whose name was Blanton. And so we had contact with Blanton over the years. I actually met Blanton one time. And then in reading a letter to my uncle Dennis, that Blanton's sister Ruth referenced that there were original letters. And so I found that relative down in Florida, and I got, so those are photocopies. I don't have the original letters from the 1870s.
How long have you been at this?
Forever. So we're talking to somebody that got 6,100 people on ancestry.com. And I have relatives, one's got 13,000 and another one's got 16,000.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah. So other people do crossword puzzles, or those jigsaw puzzles. Any others?
Right.
Do you see Jim?
Right.
Jim around.
Jim?
Did your family that immigrated to this country have communication with the people who didn't leave Ireland, your ancestors?
Not on the Crowley side, and we would love to make the connection. I've actually paid professional genealogists to find that. And I think what happens with the famine, because of the fact that they had so much guilt about leaving that disaster behind, that they just shut off everything. It was collective amnesia. They just didn't want to know. Having said that, on our Donnelly side, my grandmother Crowley, her maiden name was Donnelly. We do have some contact with some relatives from another county called Roscommon. And we visited them.
We did,
Yeah,
we did. Actually, that was a good Irish story. My mother was driving along, this was in the sixties. When we went there and she was trying to find family roots. And she drove up to a farmer and she said, do you know where,
G Beads.
yeah, do you know where T Beats is? Because she felt that they were connected. And he said, well, you don't have to go 2 months. And you don't have to go 1 month. And you don't have to go 500. Because I
And it was all these little crossroads in this county in Ireland, and they were little, and so we were lost, really badly lost, and we encountered two guys who were out chatting, which the Irish love to do. They chat, the big talkers. So we asked them how to get to T Beat's house, and they both had answers, and they went back and forth to the point where they started arguing so much that they just gave up and left. They were like. Didn't your family go to Ireland when you were?
We did. We actually had a great time. My father's best friend in architecture school was from America, but he was Irish, and he bought a kind of a watchtower, kind of a wonderful place, and we was in.
For $1, they were selling them up and down
Yeah.
Western
It
coast
really
for
went
$1.
overboard for pulling it all together. So it was in outside of Galway, sort of more in that area, and the town of Lahinch, it wasn't Lahinch, it was a very small.
But
village,
Ennis.
And it had 300 people and 11 bars.
County Court, yeah. In Molly it was
Yes,
10.
yes, so we had a great time.
Molly was 10, worked behind the bar
Yes.
with Mary.
Yes.
I
My
guess the
parents,
people
when
who
they
were at the
moved
bar were
back-
the rest of us, the family.
I should also mention that I've done a lot of reading on this, and I brought some of the books that I thought would be the best one about the Irish famine. I also brought a book by Tim Maher, who's a Worcester native.
Yeah.
And he is retired now, but that was his profession, was being an Irish historian, an Irish American historian. So I've got his book. I also went back and read his PhD thesis. We also have a fellow named William Shannon, who was a national columnist, and he wrote a book about the American Irish, and Joe Worley, the congressman, got him appointed the US ambassador. That's right. And there's other books about prohibition. So
Frank, have you looked into the history of bottled water?
I have not.
It's always been curious to me, you know,
Uh-huh.
and maybe Bill knows. I mean, there was no public water. Say,
Clean.
yeah, bottled water was clean, so it was always, there was a commercial market for it because the city water was not drinkable.
We had Polar Spring and Maine,
Mhm.
because the water wasn't filtered, and so that was in big, huge green bottles, it was fantastic.
I know some of the items that I've read where they would come out with this bottled water that they said was like a miracle cure and that type of thing. And if you drank it, you'd feel better after you had a few copies of
That
that.
sounds like alcohol.
Okay. So, but I haven't done a lot of research on it. So.
My parents, my mother moved back to Worcester in the 50s, early 50s, I guess, and with my father, and he was not from Worcester. And they separately became very good friends, the Donnellys and Callahans. And so they're going to give a dinner party. I thought, wouldn't it be nice to introduce them to each other? They were first close
Oh,
cousins.
yes.
They're closest friends and then the years that followed.
Worcester's a small place.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, great. Well, thank you, Zoom, people on Zoom. Oh my gosh, great. So super.
Let us know when part two happens.
Oh, yes, let us know about part two.
That's about like that.
That'll be fun. That'll be fun.